October 1941. The Atlantic was a vast gray expanse, waves rolling endlessly under a steel sky. From horizon to horizon, lines of Allied merchant ships cut through the cold water, their decks stacked high with tanks, trucks, ammunition, and fuel, supplies destined for a world at war. Escorting them were destroyers, cruisers, and corvettes, moving in precise formations, their sonar humming, depth charges primed, ready for the invisible threat lurking below. The ocean itself seemed to tremble beneath the weight of this floating armada, a lifeline that carried not just materiel but the very hope of victory. Below the surface, in the shadowed depths, German U-boats prowled. Their commanders, trained in stealth and aggression, peered through periscopes at the seemingly endless columns. They had hunted these waters for years, striking fear into the Allied shipping lanes. Yet something had shifted. Convoy after convoy moved with relentless efficiency. Ships that should have been sitting at the bottom of the ocean arrived safely at their destinations. Every safe arrival was a blow to morale, a whisper that the tide of war might already be turning. Quietly, inexorably beneath the waves, imagine a U-boat commander, eyes fixed on the horizon, feeling the familiar thrill of the hunt mingle with a creeping unease. Each ship that passed untouched was more than a missed opportunity. It was proof of a growing invisible force, a logistical machine the Kriegsmarine could not destroy. Somewhere in that chill Atlantic water, the seeds of doubt were planted. The Allies were building something far larger than submarines could pierce. Production, coordination, and sheer numbers were forming a shield no torpedo could break. This is the central mystery. Why did German commanders come to believe that the war was already lost? Not on the fields of France, not in the skies above Britain, but across these endless gray waves? What unseen power was at work in the movement of ships, in the hum of engines, in the synchronized choreography of convoys stretching for miles? It was a war decided not by bullets, but by timing, planning, and the relentless push of men and machines moving as one. As we peer into the cold, restless Atlantic, the lesson is already taking shape. Victory is not always won on the battlefield. Sometimes it is forged in the quiet, invisible efforts that keep armies fed, armed, and moving. And for the men of the Kriegsmarine, the sight of these convoys was more than a logistical nightmare. It was a harbinger of doom. To understand why the sight of these endless lines of ships spelled disaster for German strategy, we must first uncover how the Battle of the Atlantic began, and how the smallest decisions, made far from the front lines, would come to shape the destiny of nations. Spring 1940. Britain stood alone against the might of the German war machine. Across the English Channel, Europe had fallen into enemy hands, and the British Isles seemed isolated, a green speck resisting the shadow of conquest. Every loaf of bread, every barrel of fuel, every rifle and shell had to cross thousands of miles of treacherous ocean. The Atlantic was Britain's lifeline, a fragile corridor through which survival and victory flowed. Without it, the nation would face starvation, paralysis, and collapse. Hitler understood this vulnerability. His plan was ruthless in its simplicity: strangle Britain by cutting off its imports. If German U-boats could sink enough merchant ships, if convoys could be shattered and supply lines severed, the island fortress would crumble, not by armies storming its shores, but by hunger and deprivation. German strategy hinged on the invisible war beneath the waves, where success could decide the fate of an entire nation without a single tank rolling onto British soil. Confidence ran high in the Kriegsmarine. Admiral Karl Dönitz, architect of the U-boat arm, believed in the doctrine of wolf packs, coordinated groups of submarines that could hunt and destroy convoys with terrifying efficiency. Each U-boat was a predator, each wolf pack a hunting party striking without warning, exploiting every weakness in Allied formations. Early successes seemed to confirm Dönitz's vision. Merchant ships burned in the dark, convoys were scattered, and morale wavered in London and Liverpool alike. For a time, it looked as though the Atlantic belonged to the German submariners. The psychology of this phase of the war cannot be overstated. German commanders saw themselves as hunters in a vast open ocean. Confidence was bolstered by technology, intelligence, and sheer audacity. Every sunken freighter, every convoy disrupted, fed the illusion that victory was within reach, that the war could be won without confronting the industrial might of the Allies head-on. And yet, beneath the early triumphs, the first cracks in the plan were forming, subtle, almost imperceptible but deadly in their implications. Britain, meanwhile, had no choice but to innovate, adapt, and endure. Convoy systems were tightened, new tactics developed, and intelligence efforts expanded. The Royal Navy and the fledgling U.S. support forces began to coordinate across the Atlantic, learning how to protect the vital arteries of supply. Every success, every small victory in keeping ships afloat, was magnified, feeding the lifeline that would eventually become unstoppable. By the end of 1941, the battle lines beneath the waves had shifted in ways that German commanders could not fully see. For every ship sunk, 10 more reached port. For every wolf pack deployed, an invisible network of escorts, air patrols, and intelligence coordination countered the threat. The tide was turning quietly, invisibly, in the cold waters of the Atlantic. At first, it looked like Germany had the upper hand, but the tide of war has a way of shifting. And as the Allies began to harness the full power of logistics, coordination, and industrial might, the very ocean that Hitler sought to dominate became a highway of resilience, determination, and unbroken supply. The question loomed, could the Allies sustain it long enough to change the course of the war, or would the wolf packs finally close the noose? Summer, 1940. In the dark Atlantic, the roar of engines and the whistle of the wind masked a more sinister sound. Silent steel slicing through the waves. German U-boats prowled these waters with deadly precision. Known among their crews as the Happy Times, the months between 1940 and 1941 saw hundreds of Allied merchant ships vanish beneath the waves. Each month, hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies were claimed by torpedoes and mines, leaving convoys shattered and crews scrambling for survival. For the Kriegsmarine, it seemed almost effortless. The men in command rooms in Germany watched the reports with a mixture of pride and confidence. Admiral Donitz's doctrine of wolf packs, coordinated attacks by multiple submarines, was proving devastating. Propaganda painted the U-boats as invincible predators of the sea, stalking and destroying the lifelines of Britain with unerring efficiency. The public celebrated their feats, newspaper headlines heralding the unstoppable power of the submarine arm, while in reality, the war beneath the waves had become a chessboard of life and death. Strategy and survival. The stories from the front lines were haunting. A lone merchantman, laden with food, fuel, or ammunition, could be tracked for hours, sometimes days, as a U-boat shadowed it in the night. The crew slept in shifts, eyes scanning the dark horizon for the telltale periscope, listening for the faintest hum beneath the waves. Then, in a flash, a torpedo would strike, ripping through hull and hope alike. The survivors, if any, faced the merciless cold and the rolling Atlantic, hoping for rescue while the shadow of the U-boat slipped silently into the darkness. Yet even in these months of triumph, subtle warnings began to emerge. Not every attack succeeded. Convoys were increasingly protected by escorts, air patrols, and evasive routing. Intelligence efforts, often underestimated, were beginning to map the U-boat threat, laying the groundwork for countermeasures. And behind the scenes, the U-boat crews themselves were stretched thin, enduring the claustrophobic, dangerous life under the waves. Fatigue, mechanical failures, and miscalculations were beginning to erode the earlier confidence. Though the world still celebrated their prowess, the psychological impact was profound. German commanders began to sense the fragility hidden beneath the veneer of success. Each sunk ship was a victory, yes, but it was also a reminder that the Atlantic was vast, unpredictable, and increasingly contested. For every convoy destroyed, another slipped through the net, a silent signal that control of the ocean was far from guaranteed. And so, while the world lauded the U-boat arm as an unstoppable force, the first cracks were forming, hidden beneath the waves, unnoticed amid the triumph, yet poised to grow into a threat that Germany could neither ignore nor easily repair. But while Germany celebrated, cracks in the U-boat war machine were already beginning to show. Winter 1941. The Atlantic was no longer a hunting ground where German U-boats could strike unopposed. The Allies had begun to fight back, and the secret weapon was not a new ship, nor a new gun. It was coordination. The convoy system, once a reluctant strategy, became the lifeblood of survival. Merchant ships traveled in tight formations, surrounded by escort groups of destroyers, corvettes, and frigates, each trained to detect, deter, and destroy the lurking predators beneath the waves. No longer were freighters easy targets. Now every movement was calculated, every escort positioned with precision. Technology amplified this newfound resilience. Sonar, then called ASDIC, allowed escorts to see beneath the surface, detecting the metallic shadows of U-boats hiding in the depths. Depth charges, once crude, became weapons of accuracy and terror, capable of forcing submarines to dive, flee, or break formation. Meanwhile, intelligence breakthroughs began to tilt the invisible war. British codebreakers, working tirelessly at Bletchley Park, deciphered the secret communications of the Kriegsmarine, revealing U-boat positions, wolf-pack strategies, and even future patrol routes. For the first time, convoys moved with knowledge previously unimaginable. The effect was immediate. U-boat commanders, once confident, found their prey vanishing or worse, fighting back. Stories emerged of entire wolf packs, driven off by a single convoy's escort group, depth charges ripping through the water, forcing submarines to retreat with battered hulls and shattered morale. One merchant ship, lightly armed and considered defenseless, survived an hour-long stalking thanks to quick coordination between its escorts and the convoy commander's strategy. News of such victories spread quickly, shocking German commanders who had believed their submarines to be invincible. The balance of fear began to shift. Psychologically, the tide was changing. Where once a convoy sighted by a U-boat meant almost certain death, now it signaled resistance, calculation, and resilience. German reports began to hint at unease. "The Allies are learning," a commander wrote. "They fight differently. They do not simply run. They survive." Confidence in the U-boat arm, long a cornerstone of German strategy, was quietly eroding. And yet, even as the convoy system proved its worth, the war across the Atlantic was far from won. The Allies had discovered the power of defense, but the scale of supply needed to turn the tide required more than British ships, sailors, and ingenuity alone. The Atlantic, vast and merciless, demanded reinforcements, fresh fleets, and industrial firepower to ensure the lifeline never faltered. And then came the reinforcements from across the ocean, the United States. December 1941. The world changed overnight. With the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States was thrust fully into the war, and the Atlantic became a theater of unprecedented stakes. Suddenly, the German U-boat arm faced a new adversary, not just the Royal Navy, but the full weight of American industrial and naval power. At first, the Germans seemed to have the upper hand. Operation Drumbeat sent U-boats racing to the American eastern seaboard, where unprotected merchant ships caught unprepared were easy prey. Entire freighters vanished under the waves, and for a brief moment, the wolf packs tasted the exhilaration of what appeared to be easy, unopposed victory. But the triumph was fleeting. The United States, awakened to the immediacy of the threat, mobilized with astonishing speed. The Navy, once inexperienced in Atlantic convoy warfare, learned quickly. Tactics were refined almost daily. Escorts were dispatched, convoys organized, and new technologies, radar, sonar, and air patrol coordination, were deployed at a scale that stunned even seasoned Allied commanders. American shipyards, vast and humming with ceaseless activity, began churning out Liberty ships, destroyer escorts, and corvettes at a pace the Kriegsmarine could not hope to match. Every vessel launched was a challenge to German supremacy. Every convoy formed a silent, unstoppable army crossing the ocean. The industrial scale was staggering. Where Germany relied on a finite number of submarines, the United States could replace losses almost instantly, building ships faster than they could be sunk. Ports, docks, and repair facilities expanded, and the coordination between production, transportation, and naval deployment became a force unto itself. It was logistics as a weapon, a concept the Germans had underestimated, and one they would come to fear more than torpedoes or mines. The psychological effect on German commanders was profound. Every convoy that successfully crossed the Atlantic was proof that their submarine warfare, brilliant though it had seemed, was not enough. The sheer volume, organization, and endurance of American shipping efforts began to erode confidence. A U-boat commander could sink 1, 2, even 3 ships, but the next convoy would arrive, full and unbroken. The ocean itself seemed to have turned against them, a theater in which numbers and preparation mattered more than stealth or surprise. This period marked a turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic. The Americans were not just participating, they were reshaping the entire strategic landscape. Convoys grew longer, more numerous, and increasingly protected. Every shipment was a testament to American resolve and industrial might. And German planners began to recognize that the war's outcome might hinge not on any single battle, but on the unrelenting, invisible flow of supply across the ocean. Soon, German commanders would see something they could hardly believe: endless convoys stretching beyond the horizon. By mid-1942, the Atlantic had transformed into a river of steel, a relentless flow of ships that seemed to stretch from horizon to horizon. American shipyards roared day and night, producing Liberty ships faster than German U-boats could sink them. Hull after hull rolled off assembly lines, fully armed and laden with the supplies that Britain and the Allies desperately needed. Where once a single wolf pack could disrupt a convoy for days, now dozens of vessels moved together, their strength in numbers and coordination rendering the U-boats increasingly impotent. Convoys swelled. What had begun as clusters of a dozen or 20 merchantmen now numbered in the hundreds, escorted by destroyers, corvettes, and even long-range aircraft. Each convoy was a carefully orchestrated symphony of movement and protection. Ships zigzagged, sonar beams swept the depths, and air patrols scoured the sky for periscopes or torpedo wakes. The Atlantic, once dominated by stealth and surprise, had become a gauntlet that favored preparation, coordination, and industrial output over cunning and luck. U-boat captains were beginning to despair. Diaries and reports from the period reveal a grim awareness. "The ocean is full of targets we cannot sink fast enough," one wrote, a mixture of frustration and awe in his tone. The sheer volume of shipping meant that no single wolf pack, no matter how coordinated or skilled, could make a meaningful dent. Every loss was absorbed. Every convoy that arrived safely reinforced the invisible wall of Allied logistics. The psychological tide was shifting as rapidly as the physical one. What once inspired fear now sowed anxiety. This turning point was not only a matter of quantity, but of innovation. Tactics evolved, escort groups became hunting teams, and anti-submarine measures, depth charges, radar, sonar, coordinated attacks, transformed defense into offense. The Allies were learning to predict, trap, and destroy the very hunters that had once ruled the Atlantic. Each convoy became both shield and spear, delivering vital supplies while simultaneously weakening the German U-boat arm. And yet, the German high command struggled to adapt. For every U-boat lost, more ships arrived at port. For every attack foiled, the Allies' confidence and tactical expertise grew. The ocean that had once been a hunting ground now seemed to mock the very hunters, a vast expanse in which the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. But the Allies weren't just building more ships. They were building a war machine that hunted U-boats to extinction. 1942-43. The Atlantic, once a shadowy battlefield where U-boats struck unseen, was beginning to glow with the light of innovation. Radar pierced the fog and darkness, revealing periscopes that had once slipped past undetected. Hedgehog mortars, new weapons that launched explosive charges ahead of pursuing ships, gave escorts the ability to attack submarines before they could strike. Long-range patrol aircraft patrolled skies previously unreachable, their searchlights and depth charges making the ocean a deadly theater for any submarine that surfaced. Escort carriers, small aircraft carriers attached to convoys, extended the Allies' reach even further, ensuring that no wolf pack could move without being seen. Above all, intelligence became the invisible weapon. At Bletchley Park, brilliant minds worked tirelessly to break the Enigma code. The Allies could now intercept and decipher U-boat communications in near real time, rerouting convoys away from danger, ambushing submarines, and anticipating wolf pack movements. The hunters became the hunted, their every maneuver predicted and countered. The psychological impact on German commanders was profound. A network of unseen eyes and ears now shadowed every decision, and every success they achieved felt provisional, fragile, and fleeting. Losses among the U-boat fleet mounted. Skilled commanders, once celebrated as masters of the sea, were lost to the depths, their submarines destroyed by technologies that had not existed a few months earlier. Reports circulated back to Germany of entire wolf packs decimated, their positions betrayed not by courage or error, but by intelligence, coordination, and technological superiority. The confidence that had carried Donuts and his men through the happy times now eroded, replaced by apprehension, disbelief, and fear. First-hand accounts illustrate the terror of this new phase. Captains wrote of the ocean that had once offered anonymity and advantage now feeling alive with detection, every sound and shadow a threat. Tactics that had once guaranteed stealth were obsolete, replaced by defensive measures that made the U-boats' hunting grounds hostile and lethal. The Atlantic was no longer a sea of opportunity. It had become a gauntlet of unseen hunters, relentless and unforgiving. By 1943, The transformation was clear. Convoys moved with unprecedented confidence. Technology provided eyes where once there were none, and intelligence guided every maneuver. German commanders faced a sobering truth. The very weapon that had once promised victory, the U-boat, was now increasingly vulnerable. Hunted across the waves it had once ruled, by 1943, the hunters had become the hunted. May 1943. The Atlantic had become a graveyard for Germany's submarines. In what would later be called Black May, U-boat losses skyrocketed. In just a single month, 41 submarines were destroyed, along with their crews, many of them veterans of years of undersea warfare. Convoys, once easy prey, now arrived largely intact, escorted by a growing network of destroyers, aircraft, and escort carriers that hunted relentlessly. The ocean, which had once promised opportunity and supremacy, had become a deadly gauntlet. For the first time, Admiral Dönitz, the architect of the U-boat arm, publicly admitted the unthinkable: defeat in the Battle of the Atlantic. His words, carefully measured, concealed the gravity of the situation. German commanders, reading reports from the front lines, felt a creeping fear that stretched beyond the loss of submarines. Every convoy that reached port safely was proof that the Allies' industrial might, tactical innovation, and intelligence coordination had created something unstoppable. The war was no longer a contest of clever strategy alone. It was a test of endurance and scale, and Germany was losing. Fear spread through the Kriegsmarine like a cold fog. Veteran captains questioned plans. Wolfpacks hesitated where once they struck without thought, and command rooms buzzed with concern over the inability to stop the tide. The Atlantic, once a hunting ground, had become a mirror of strategic failure, reflecting the limits of what stealth, skill, and courage could achieve against a foe that moved with unrelenting volume and coordination. First-hand accounts from surviving U-boat crews reveal the psychological strain. Each attack repelled, each depth charge evaded, each convoy arriving intact chipped away at confidence. Men who had once embraced the thrill of the hunt now faced anxiety, exhaustion, and the unnerving realization that the ocean itself no longer favored them. The strategic advantage Germany had relied upon for years, the ability to cut Britain's lifeline, was gone. The true weight of the moment went beyond submarines and ships. The safe arrival of each convoy ensured that tanks, guns, fuel, and food continued to flow to Europe, supporting armies, building infrastructure, and sustaining morale. The invisible power of logistics had become tangible, and German commanders recognized a grim reality. The war could not be won if supply lines remained unbroken. And so, as the last U-boat of Black May limped home or sank beneath the waves, a chilling question crystallized in the minds of German leaders. If endless convoys could not be stopped, if the flow of men and material was unstoppable, what did that mean for the war as a whole? But why did endless convoys mean certain doom for Germany's entire war effort? By late 1943, the Atlantic had become the backbone of Allied victory. Each convoy that crossed its gray expanse carried far more than steel and fuel. It carried the promise of armies ready to strike, the lifeblood of nations resisting tyranny, and the tools that would make global strategy possible. Tanks, artillery, trucks, and ammunition flowed ceaselessly to the British Isles in preparation for the day the Allies would launch the largest invasion the world had ever seen: D-Day. Across the Eastern Front, convoys brought Lend-Lease supplies to the Soviet Union: food, trucks, aircraft, fueling the fight that would stretch German forces to the breaking point. Every ship that arrived safely represented not just survival, but the mounting weight of global coordination and industrial might. Inside Germany, the mood had darkened. In private, commanders admitted what was impossible to say publicly: the Reich could not match the output of the United States and its allies. For every submarine, aircraft, or tank Germany deployed, 10 more were produced on the other side of the ocean. The calculus was brutal. No clever strategy, no wolf-pack tactic, no surprise attack could overcome the unrelenting flood of men and materiel. Convoys became symbols of inevitability, a moving demonstration that sheer scale, preparation, and resilience could outmatch any battlefield brilliance. The psychological impact on German command was profound. Diaries and confidential reports reveal a growing awareness. The war was no longer being decided in isolated battles, but in factories, shipyards, and ports thousands of miles away. Every convoy that arrived unscathed was a message written in steel and fuel. The Allies would endure, adapt, and overwhelm. Where once the ocean had been a realm of stealth and terror, it had become a stage for industrial dominance. German leaders, even the most optimistic, could see the trajectory. The war was slipping from their hands, not because of a lack of courage, but because their enemies had harnessed the invisible power of logistics, turning supply lines into strategic weapons. Convoys became more than a tactical success. They were a symbol of American ingenuity, British resilience, and the unstoppable momentum of coordinated effort. Each ship represented planning, foresight, and the capacity to act on a scale that Germany could not match. For the Allied leadership, it was proof that the war could be won not just with bullets or bombs, but with organization, coordination, and unrelenting production. For German commanders, it was proof that no plan, no fleet, and no submarine arm could overcome an adversary who could deliver the world's resources to the right place, at the right time without fail. By late 1943, the Atlantic had ceased to be a contested zone. It had become a highway of inevitability, a living monument to the idea that in modern warfare, the most important battles are often fought far from the front lines. German planners began to accept the unavoidable. The more convoys that sailed, the closer their defeat became, a lesson written in steel and salt water, impossible to ignore. The sight of convoys wasn't just about ships, it was about destiny. May 1945. The guns finally fell silent, but for Germany's U-boat commanders, the silence carried the weight of failure. In interrogation rooms after the war, many admitted to a grim realization. Long before Allied armies stormed Normandy or Soviet troops marched into Berlin, they had already sensed the war was lost. Out there, in the endless gray expanse of the Atlantic, the convoys had become an unstoppable tide. Every freighter that reached Britain, every Liberty ship that docked in Murmansk or Liverpool, was proof that the Reich's strategy had failed. One commander described the sight of those convoys as the shadow of inevitability itself. For German naval officers, it was a bitter irony. The U-boat, once hailed as the decisive weapon, had been outmatched not by brilliance in a single battle, but by the quiet, relentless strength of organization. The wolf packs had sunk thousands of ships, but they had not broken the chain. The Allies had learned, adapted, and above all, produced. In the end, production lines and convoy routes became as decisive as tanks at Kursk or bombers over the Ruhr. The convoy system changed naval warfare forever. What began as a desperate measure, merchant ships huddled together for mutual defense, evolved into a sophisticated choreography of escorts, aircraft, and intelligence. It was not just defense, it was strategy. Each convoy was a floating fortress, bristling with depth charges, sonar, and long-range patrols. Each was a moving symbol that the ocean could be commanded, not by dominance in every square mile, but by protecting the arteries of supply that kept nations alive. For the Allies, the lesson was profound. Wars are not won by battles alone. They are won by endurance, by sustaining the flow of resources across vast distances, by ensuring that armies at the front never run dry of food, fuel, or ammunition. The Atlantic proved that logistics, the quiet, often invisible art of supply, was as powerful as any weapon of war. The legacy echoes far beyond World War II. In every modern conflict, planners study not only how to fight, but how to feed, fuel, and reinforce. Navies around the world adopted the principles forged in the Atlantic: protect the lifelines, shield the supply routes, and the war can be sustained until victory is possible. Today, the Atlantic looks calm, its waves rolling endlessly under gray skies. The convoys are gone, but their memory lingers. Beneath the surface lie the wrecks of freighters and U-boats alike, silent reminders of the invisible war fought mile by mile, ship by ship, across that vast expanse. And if you listen closely, not with ears, but with imagination, you can almost hear it still, the steady churn of engines, the creak of steel hulls, the disciplined hum of escorts moving in formation. To Allied sailors, it was the sound of survival. To German commanders, it was something else entirely. For the men in U-boats, the endless convoys were more than ships. They were the sound of defeat approaching.